all, Ida will be graduating in a couple of weeks with a double major in politics as well as a Bachelor of Arts degree in economics. That's a good double major, right, Ben? Ben would agree. Ida was also a participant in the College Honors Program and was involved in a host of different extracurricular activities, very meaningful activities here on campus. She was involved with the Collaboratory, and I won't go through all of the specific projects that she took part in. She also was a member of the American Enterprise Institute's Executive Council here on campus. During the summer, she has interned with the Public Defender's Office in Bel Air, Maryland. And last but certainly not least has been her involvement with the college lacrosse team, the women's lacrosse team. And she's had another great season, and she has served not only as a player, but also in a leadership position as captain. Most of you probably know that Ida will be attending law school this fall. I won't say a lot about that either, other than to note that a lot of law schools want Ida this fall. And Ida plans to specialize in both criminal defense and immigration law. Without further ado, the title of Ida's senior project for the College Honors Program and also for major honors in politics is Transatlantic Lessons in Refugee Policy, comparing refugee law, policy, and programs of the United States and Germany. Please join me in welcoming Ida.
Thank you all for coming to hear this presentation today. It's been definitely a year of hard work and research, and I really appreciate the way that everyone in this room has contributed some way, in your own unique way, to the finalization of this project. So what it's been is an evaluation of refugee policy in the United States and in Germany. And it's particularly relevant right now in light of the refugee crisis going on in Europe and our own kind of reevaluation of refugee policy in the United States right now in light of recent elections and new administrations. So fortunately when I picked this in the fall, I didn't know about all the changes that were going to happen in our own country, but it's really kind of made what I've been researching and what I've been learning about all the more relevant to our everyday lives. So I picked Germany to compare with the United States and their policy because as the U.S. has always been a leader in accepting migrants and refugees, Germany has too been one of the has taken in some of the most refugees and migrants over the years since World War II. And right now they're currently accepting the most asylum seekers from Syria out of any industrialized nations outside of the region. And so both of these countries are enormous players in the international world in refugee policy, and their own policy in each country has ramifications beyond the borders of each nation, has ramifications to the entire international community in the way people are able to move across and between borders and across countries. So when comparing two different countries, it's important to kind of remember that they too are different and they're not comparable in every aspect. And one of the biggest differences in the United States and Germany immediately is size of each country. And so as you can see, Germany is a lot smaller than the US in terms of population and land mass, like area size. Germany is really only about 3 times the size of Pennsylvania. You can see kind of the differences in square mileage and the differences in population size. One of the most interesting differences is looking at population density per square mile, and Germany has 235 people per square mile, where the U.S. only has 84. So when you look around and hear 100,000 people migrating to one country, also keep in mind the difference in sizes. When 100,000 people come to the United States, we have a lot of places for them to go and kind of find homes, but when 100,000 people migrate to Germany, it puts a much bigger strain on their infrastructure. So the next thing to kind of look at is what is a refugee and how is that different than a migrant? Well, refugees, defined by the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, is defined as someone who has been forced to flee his or her country because of persecution, war, or violence. They have a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group, and most likely they cannot return home or are afraid to do so. War and ethnic, tribal, and religious violence are leading causes of refugees fleeing their countries. And this is different from a migrant who typically will move from one country to another seeking better economic standing, looking for jobs, or to join family. Refugees are forced to flee their country because they're no longer able to stay there and stay safe. And so this comes into play most when kind of looking at how international and national law plays in the resettlement of refugees and migrants. Migrants aren't protected under international law. There's no legal mandate for a country to accept migrants from another country. Refugees, on the other hand, because they're fleeing persecution, in 1951, the Refugee Convention in Geneva set up these protocols for countries that would sign on to the treaty saying, we will accept refugees, we will accept asylum seekers and not let them go back to their country. We won't send them back to places of harm if they come seeking asylum in our country. And so there's also national laws that countries can put in place. Like, countries can deny asylum seekers based on certain grounds, but they have to consider their application. And so these are just some statistics of refugees in the world. As you can see, there's a difference between refugees and internally displaced persons. Internally displaced persons have not left the country where they've been displaced, as in there could be civil war going on, things that would cause them to leave their home and their community, but usually they'll move into some sort of refugee camp in that country before they can cross the border. So why is this important to us? I mean, yes, it's policy in our country, so it affects us in some way, but thankfully none of us are refugees, and so how does this still affect us? So there's a couple reasons why accepting refugees actually can help us apart from any moral obligations we have to them. Number one is accepting refugees, especially from the Middle East today, reduces the chances of them radicalizing. When refugees are stuck in these refugee camps in these poor conditions, often the only opportunity they have to get out of that, besides applying for refugee status, is by joining a terrorist network. And so by helping them get out of these refugee camps and find another alternative to their poor conditions, there's less of a chance of them radicalizing and joining a terrorist network. Also, refugees increase financial activity and help strengthen our economies. There was a study done in Cleveland where the city of Cleveland spent $4.8 million to resettle and assimilate refugees, and that year they saw a $48 million net revenue from the activity. And 60 hours of cultural training where they go over what it means. They go over German history, they go over how to shop in the grocery market, how to live with neighbors, things that we take for granted, but refugees who have grown up there and lived in a refugee camp for 40 years don't understand what it means to go to a grocery store and buy food for the week or make their meals like from that food. It's a very different culture that they need to be educated on. And so another benefit, another strength, like I said before, is the equal distribution to the German states and how that is able to kind of spread the burden and kind of keep when there is a heavy burden, people tend to be more resentful toward refugees, and so this helps keep that from happening. And so some challenges from each case. In the United States, our cultural training is 5 days, and it happens a couple weeks before they're even transported to the U.S. So a lot of times refugees are thrown with all this information, they don't know how to process it, and then weeks pass by before they even come to the United States and have to apply it. So what we're doing right now isn't the most effective way to kind of train refugees into what to expect when they come to the United States. Also, there's a lot of language barriers with learning English. There's no federal kind of language courses to give refugees. We have a lot of, fortunately, through these private sponsorship agencies and through churches and NGOs in the country, there's like English as a second language courses that refugees can take, but because they have language barriers, they don't know about these services, they don't know how to ask for medical help, and they don't know how to access services that they've been given. And then there's also problems with security screening and how long that it takes. Refugees who have common names or who come from places where there are poor birth records are often the refugees who come from the poorest regions, and they're the ones who they get stuck in the security screening process for months and months because it's hard to find out where they came from and to verify the information that they're telling. And so those vulnerable refugees kind of face a lot of hurdles that we could eliminate. And so some of the strengths in Germany, or challenges in Germany, one is just the general infrastructure of housing all these refugees. Germany last year took in 800,000 asylum seekers, and if you compare that to the United States, we were about to accept 110,000 refugees this year, and we thought that was a lot. 800,000 is an exorbitant amount for such a small country, and so they have a lot of problems figuring out where to house refugees. Like a lot of times, I've heard stories about refugees living in the gyms of schools. They'll set up like a refugee facility center because they don't have enough room in their reception centers to for people to live. There's also in Europe, there's these Dublin Regulations, which means that when a refugee applies for asylum, in whatever country they apply for asylum, that country is then responsible for them. And so the goal of this policy is that once the EU wants to keep refugees from applying for asylum in multiple countries, because then it complicates the process, it's hard to tell where to give them asylum, and it complicates what country has to take care of them. And so the reason this is a challenge for Germany is because a lot of refugees are coming to Germany first before they go anywhere else in the EU. They're applying for asylumship in Germany, and then when they travel to another country, that country is saying, no, go back to Germany, we don't want you. And so Germany doesn't have enough room for all these refugees, and the refugees have nowhere else to go. And then lastly, there's been a perceived increase in crime by refugees. And so this has been a challenge for Germany because this has really hurt public opinion. I don't know if any of you heard about the sexual assault cases over New Year's Eve in towns in Germany. 31, they found 31 people who allegedly committed these sexual assaults, and 18 of them were asylees in Germany. And so a lot of the public in Germany was outraged that they were bringing in and helping these people, but then these people were turning around and committing crimes. And so the media really picked up on this, and all of Europe really picked up on this, and there's been a huge increase in distrust towards refugees because of this. But a study by Brigham Young University actually found that as refugees have increased, rates of rape and crime have not increased along with them. So yet, while this was a horrendous situation, it's not necessarily it doesn't necessarily show the whole picture of what is going on in Europe. So lastly, we can kind of look at how can the U.S. kind of look at what Germany's done and improve our own systems and policies in response. And so first of all, the U.S. needs to increase funding for refugee programs. This graph I have right here kind of shows the funding, the budget service for different parts of kind of refugee programs. And so we can see that funding for unaccompanied minors has increased dramatically over the last few years, and that's because there has been a huge surge of unaccompanied minors crossing our southern border. And so the budget for that has increased in response. But as we've seen increases in the amount of refugees that the United States is taking in, we've only seen the budget kind of staying fairly flat over the last 25 years. And so in order to care for the increased amount of refugees in the world, we need to increase our own budget for them. And then also we need to find ways to protect refugees from these overbearing security concerns. And right now, our security process is under review, and so hopefully this time will be used to find ways that we can improve security. And since 9/11, I think there's been only 12 reported cases of refugees being arrested due to terrorism-related charges that were present before they entered the country. And so our security measure, and that's out of the over 700,000 refugees that we've accepted since then. And so those numbers definitely show that our security screening process has been working, but it still has been keeping out some of the most vulnerable refugees. And then there needs to be an improved coordination between agencies, an expanded orientation and cultural training. And I think that can really come about by adopting kind of the idea of the German reception centers, where they have all these services in one place for refugees to kind of access, to live if needed, and to find help when they need to. And so right now we have so many different executive branches and NGOs providing services to refugees, but they don't know how to take advantage of these services. There's a lot lost in the bureaucracy and the shuffling of people from one agency to the next. So if we can somehow streamline that process by bringing our systems together, by even having central locations for refugees to access, then that would really help the overall process. And then lastly, improving public opinion will be a huge thing moving forward. If we want to be able to care for refugees, we need to have these discussions and not just listen to the negative things that we hear. There's a lot of positives from refugees coming into our country, and while there are challenges, these are things that we can talk about. And it's great that, I'm so glad that my project this year has kind of become so relevant and become so vital and in line with national topics that people are talking about, because as our refugee policy is being reviewed, these are things that we should care about and can talk to each other, our families, our classmates, and kind of learn more about this and learn how we can make an impact. So even if the only thing that happens from this project is that people come away learning something new about refugee policy and refugees in general, then that's a start to moving forward. So if anyone has any questions, I'd love to hear them now. Jamie.
Hi. Could you speak a little bit on how increased security measures will affect incoming refugees who have no affiliations with any terrorist organizations?
Mm-hmm. So I think one assumption is that if we can increase our security measures and improve our security measures, then if for refugees who have no affiliation with terrorist organizations, how will that hurt them? I mean, yes, it may take longer for them to come into the United States, but it won't necessarily keep them out because they have nothing to worry about, right? But the problem is a lot of our what's defined as terrorist groups by the Immigration and Nationality Act is a very loose definition and very broad definition. It doesn't distinguish between like rebel causes who are fighting an oppressive government. It doesn't distinguish between like groups. It says literally if it's a group of 2 or more people with like, it could be a group of 2 people who could be a terrorist organization. And so what is the balance of whether or not someone is kind of working with a terrorist organization? And it doesn't, it also defines like affiliation as knowingly or reasonably should have known, providing any sort of resources to a terrorist organization, and so that doesn't like compensate for coercion. And so I was reading about this one farmer, Miguel, who his family lived in Colombia, and they were forced to pay taxes to a local terrorist network for their own safety, and eventually things got too violent in that region. They fled to Ecuador, but when they applied for refugee status in the United States, they were denied because they had helped fund a terrorist organization in Colombia. And so the U.S. will grant waivers to that sort of situation, but it's on the refugee to provide proof that they were coerced, which is often challenging for them to do so.
Seems like if you do streamline it and make it easier for people to get in, then you know, much more likely have a issue with number 5 up there with the public perception. You know, if they, it seems to me like if you get a few bad refugees who cause a lot of problems, then that's going to cause everybody else to suffer a lot more than if you let a few questionable people in who probably should have gotten in.
And I think that comes to changing the perspective of when there is a problem. I know for illegal immigration right now, a lot of times when there's a problem with an illegal immigrant, people say, well, it's because we have too much illegal immigration. And so when an illegal immigrant sexually assaults someone, instead of looking at the problems with sexual assault in our country, we blame immigration. And so when there is violence and crime in our country, which there will always be, we need to look at those problems separately from being caused by refugees and foreigners coming into our country, because those do exist now, and whether or not people come in, they're going to exist anyway. And so addressing those root problems. And one thing that I admire about Germany is in response to those sexual assaults on New Year's Eve, they passed new legislation about sexual violence and what it means to report sexual assault. And so they didn't just blame refugees and say, we need to not let people into our country because they're going to do bad things. They said, what problems do we already have going on? How can we fix them? But that's a great point.
You mentioned the sort of macro financial benefits of immigration. You could say a little bit more about that, how different parts of the American people might experience that or not, see that or not, and then also how that relates to your comments about trying to improve public opinion, because I imagine in some people's minds those two things are somewhat connected.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of people, even when they just hear about foreign workers coming in, they get worried, oh no, I'm going to lose my job, and we're going to have to pay welfare for these people. what is the cost for us really, and is it worth it? Like, are they going to give back? And so the thing with bringing refugees is, yes, we're going to have to put out a little bit of money to help them kind of integrate and receive services that they desperately need to receive language training. But refugees coming in from places where they've lost everything, they come to America with like a heart and a mind to work and to give back to the community that's welcomed them in. And a lot of refugees bring in differences in culture, and they're able to start businesses. They bring in different educational backgrounds, and so they bring a diversity to our economy, which fortunately we do have a diverse economy. We have a diverse nation, but they bring in a diversity that only strengthens our economy and starts businesses, and they hire American workers. I don't know if you guys have heard of sriracha hot sauce. It's pretty common, but that was started by a Vietnamese refugee who came over with his family in the 1970s. And so businesses like that, any sort of entrepreneurship, that refugees are starting, those are directly conducive to the community. And a lot of people, when they meet refugees, like, and see how hardworking they are, they're like, yes, these people are great. It's like the mindset, yes, I like my neighbors, the people who just started that business and are upstanding citizens, but it's the unknowns that I don't want coming in, and the people who I don't know, and those are who I'm afraid of. And so, like, when we see refugees who are working hard, we need to give them the benefit of the doubt and say there's more people like that, not what we've kind of made them out to be.
The question, Ida, you also on the topic of influencing public opinion, as you're aware and everybody's aware here, over the last several years, nationalist sentiment, which is in large part anti-immigrant sentiment, has intensified certainly in the developed world, in Europe and in the United States. Do you see any evidence, and that's given birth to political parties, the National Front in France, Alternative for Germany in Germany. Do you see any evidence, or are you optimistic that that nationalist anti-immigrant sentiment, public opinion, has peaked? Are you optimistic that it will subside? No.
I am not so optimistic that it will subside, especially in Europe. And we've talked about this in some of our classes, that I think Europe does have a little bit of an identity crisis when it comes to who they are, because it's, am I German? Am I European? What does it mean to be European? And so in America, we say, well, what's it mean to be American? It means to be bought into the ideals of our Constitution. In Europe, that's more difficult because they have such a long history of each country, and it's harder to buy into the ideals of this togetherness and unity. And so I think that is one reason why these populist nationalist parties have become so popular. And with Brexit happening, I don't see that. I mean, unless it goes really badly and other countries are like, never mind, we want to stay with Europe, I don't see it as peaking now. It will probably continue to rise before it peaks. Any last questions?
I have a quick question. When you're talking about the application process for immigrants or asylum seekers to come in, it's a long 9-step process. Do they have to pay for that, or is it like a federally funded program? Who funds that?
Yes, it's federally funded. Immigrants don't need to pay to be interviewed. I mean, refugees don't need to pay to be interviewed. That is funded by the Department of State, Homeland Security, and Health and Human Services. And then once they come to the United States, that is when there's a lot more private sponsorship and funding toward refugees. And that's another reason, if we can increase public opinion, then it'll be definitely easier to spend more money on refugees.
Did you say that, you said it always is a third party in the vetting process for us, right? Yeah.
When we bring in refugees.
So would you suggest taking out that step if there was any way possible?
So, we do accept asylum seekers, but asylum seekers can really only come to the United States from like bordering countries.
Right.
You can't hop on a plane and fly to the United States and seek asylum. So we do accept asylum seekers from Mexico, Central America, but that process is different, and we will occasionally they can be granted refugee status, but it's much less common for that to happen. They're usually granted asylum status, which means that after several years they'll go back kind of once the turmoil in their home country has died down.
So there's no way to change that part of the process?
Yeah, there wouldn't be a way unless, because it would be difficult to bring refugee applicants to the United States and then have to send them away. That, I think the cost of that would be too big and confusing to make possible.
I guess one question, this is like pretty recent, so you probably didn't have could have considered it. I think it was like this past Sunday or something, Turkey held a referendum to abolish like democracy pretty much in the country. And they won. They're like they're going to be like, I guess essentially non-democratic. But I know Recep Erdogan, whatever his role, whatever, he's now like the leader. He like threatened to release all of Turkey's immigrants into Europe, and that was like his kind of playing card to say like international community, like don't try to stop this, like we're abolishing democracy. Like I don't know if your like research has any like answers for how we feel that, because like that's kind of hard to like
Yeah, I mean, and Turkey has so many refugees there right now. If they were to do that, it would definitely be one of the worst things that could happen to Europe, especially with the way Europe kind of has been handling refugees. To have that immense influx it would definitely increase the position and support for the nationalist parties, and I think it would just result in a lot of crime against refugees. In terms of any sort of solution, I wish I had an answer to that, I guess. To not support the shift from democracy, but that is like a real threat to, and as sad as it is to say, we'll release our refugees, take that, as sad as it is to say we actually can't take that, that would definitely put an immense strain on Europe.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I know nothing about the topic, so you can forgive my ignorance, other than what you just taught me. You started out talking a little bit about kind of refugees and immigration together, but then it seemed like it focuses more on refugees as I kind of process what you're saying. But I kind of wonder in the American experience whether those two things are just conflated in some way. As much as we rake ourselves over the coals about immigration policy and so forth, recent counts suggest we have 45 or 50 million immigrants, legal and undocumented. And I just kind of wonder how that kind of number compares to German policies in terms of numbers of immigrants actually in Germany. I suspect it's not quite so unfavorable as the refugee numbers are. That's not saying anything about our politics of refugees. I think it's atrocious, some of the things that have happened. But I kind of wonder whether politically those things are easily separable. We actually do have a very large immigrant population in the United States. And I think that the politics of the situation makes it very hard to separate out those as two separate issues. So I'm just interested in your comments about that.
Well, one thing in Germany is that because they're a member of the EU, there's a lot of free immigration between EU countries. And so when Germany kind of considers its amount of immigrants, and I don't know how many immigrants it has exactly, but it kind of differentiates between EU member immigrants and non-EU member immigrants. So that's kind of one, I guess, aspect to it. And then the other, in terms of whether or not refugee and immigrant are even politically different, is that I think possibly in terms of public opinion and public perception, there's a little bit less of a difference, and especially once you also consider kind of undocumented immigrants. I think that they all kind of get blended together in terms of who can come to the United States, who do we want, and how do we treat them. But I think in terms of politically speaking, there is very distinct differences in kind of international laws that govern how we treat refugees and migrants. And then in terms of, I guess, I know like President Trump, he instated that travel ban, which kind of, blocked people from certain countries coming to the United States. And I think when people start to think immigration from a Muslim country and refugee status from a Muslim country, I think that's when kind of the lines blur in terms of public understanding of what the two are. But politically speaking, there should be a difference in how we treat them and kind of how we approach each group, if that was helpful at all.